Good morning again. I'm trying to channel my inner Cedric. I feel like Cedric always teaches sitting down. And so I'm going to talk about a little history. And for those who don't know, I have a degree in math, so I'm not very good at history sometimes. So bear with me. But happy 4th of July. I know some of us probably have a love-hate relationship with this holiday, and rightfully so. It's kind of hard to celebrate the American struggle over what it really means to be created equally and all people with inalienable rights whenever we still feel this struggle today. So I wanted to tell you kind of a fun fact, though, about the 4th of July. And some of you who are history buffs, you probably already know this. But these are two of our founding frenemies. I call them frenemies because they're friend enemies. This is John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, and they were two of our founding fathers. But did you know that the Declaration of Independence was actually signed on July 2nd? Did you know this? If you did, pretend like you didn't. It was actually signed 2 days earlier, and John Adams, because he said that was America's real birthday, refused to participate in the 4th of July. So, isn't that fun? Ironically, he died on July 4th, as did Thomas Jefferson. So, you're welcome. The more you know. But the more interesting part of their story is that they were close friends to the point of calling each other family until they disagreed on how the country should be run at a fundamental level. So they ended up as part of two different political parties, the Federalists and the Republicans, and tension grew so much that Jefferson resigned from the cabinet and Adams was ticked off. He was so mad and he started to spill all the tea, mostly about Jefferson's relationship with a certain slave woman. So fast forward to the year 1800, they ran against each other for president. It's considered to be one of the nastiest elections in history. So you think our elections are bad? This reminds me that this has been going on for a long time. Jefferson hired a sleazy journalist to smear Adams' name during the election. Adams won, and he tried to talk Jefferson into coming on and running a bipartisan office. And Jefferson said no, and then left town, did not even stay for the inauguration. We've heard of that before. So they did not, I need to stay on script. That was not on script, and I need to stay on script. They didn't talk for 12 years at that point, 12 years. And then after 12 years passed, they decided they would start writing letters, 158 to be exact. So they wrote letters back and forth for 14 years. And eventually Adams wrote to Jefferson, "You and I should not die before we explain ourselves to each other." So they continued to talk back and forth through these letters, and maybe they only heard each other because it was through a letter. I'm not sure. But I do know that they reconciled and found in the end that they agreed on more than they realized they did. As I read that story about these two men, I immediately had specific names pop in my head of family and friends, relationships that have been struggling, especially for the past year, because we've lost the ability to really talk to each other. We've decided that we are more for what we're against than what we're for. And yes, boundaries are good, boundaries are healthy, but if I'm self-aware and honest as I sit on this stage, sometimes what was centered in those conversations was more of my false certitude of superiority instead of my actual values and the way that I love people. Today, we're continuing a series called Pineapple Pizza and Other Things We Disagree On. If it's your first Sunday joining us, you're probably thinking, where's the pizza? Sorry to burst your bubble, but there's not pizza involved. There's no judgment if you feel like you want to leave now. I get it. But why did we call this series Pineapple Pizza? It's because over the last year, our staff has sat around that table and we have watched our world and our own relationships. And we've started to question how we see and how we listen to people that we don't understand and people we don't agree with. Because if Watershed wants to claim being an inclusive community for all, then we have to at least attempt to approach this life with an unexplainable curiosity and openness. So with the help of a podcast by respectable spiritual leaders called Learning How to See, we embarked on this quest to expand our worldview by recognizing our biases. During the first 4 weeks of this series, Scott, Matt, David, and Sean have covered confirmation bias, complexity bias, complementarity bias, contact bias, conservative and liberal bias, comfort and complacency bias, and consciousness bias. And today, I want to talk about community bias. Community bias says it's almost impossible for us to see what our community doesn't, can't, or won't see. Mimetic theory and social identity theory actually tell us that we choose our tribe over the truth. And most of the time we do this, and we don't even realize we do it. Social scientist Rene Girard studied human desire thoroughly. And in his studies, he developed something called mimetic theory. This says that our desires actually come from observation and mimicry, which is basically imitation. We create communities that hate all the same people, fear all the same people, and like all the same people. We end up in a fantasy world where everyone's actions echo the same thoughts, see with the same eyes, and repeat the same opinions over and over. And the saddest part of this, to me, is not even necessarily our loss of autonomy. It's the scapegoating. Scapegoats have existed long before today. Ancient societies practiced ritual scapegoating, which is where they symbolically transferred the sin and blame of a community onto a person or an animal in order to absolve themselves of guilt and to perpetuate peace among their citizens. The term scapegoat we see in the Bible in Leviticus 16, and there we read about the priest Aaron who cast lots over 2 goats on Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement. One goat was set apart for Yahweh to be a blood sacrifice for sin, and the other goat was designated as Azazel, the goat that departs. So the priest Aaron would lay his hands on the second goat and symbolically transfer the sins of the community to this goat before sending it away out into the wilderness. In other ancient societies, humans served as scapegoats, and these victims were exiled or killed for the good of the community. Human scapegoats tended to be people who were seen as dispensable: criminals, people with physical deformities, outsiders, or anyone who exhibited noticeable differences from the rest of their tribe. Girard says that we think we have come farther than we have, in that we actually still have scapegoats today. We're just better at hiding it. There are 4 reasons that we scapegoat others: extreme dislike, fear, ignorance, and the displacement of blame from powerful originators to those who are perceived to be weaker. Scapegoating can be one-on-one, it can be group-on-one, it can be one-on-group, when a person blames a group for a problem that they did not cause, like wars, death, financial losses, and other personal struggles. Finally, one of the most interesting forms of scapegoating is the group on group. This occurs when one group blames another for problems that the groups collectively experience, which might be economic, it might be political in nature, like blaming a party for the Great Depression or the Great Recession. Most of us today participate in scapegoating without even knowing it, because we consciously or unconsciously keep minority groups among us in a position of oppression, all with the purpose of protecting ourselves or protecting our own. We've also seen this in the Bible. In the book of Galatians, we get to hear Paul share the stories of the Jews and the Gentiles. There's an in-group and there's an out-group. There's a tribe, then there's the truth. There's a scapegoat, a common enemy, a villain. In the book of Galatians, Paul is exposing a virus that has infected these churches, a virus that has told them that it's the law who decides who's in and out. And Paul's antidote to this virus is freedom. For some, freedom is too wild, too unpredictable, and too available. Those people are the same people that say, surely Jesus didn't mean everybody. They are the ones who are arguing that you have to prove your allegiance to be part of their tribe. And the way they wanted this in Galatians was through circumcision, through a little piece of skin. In Galatians chapter 5, verses 2 through 6, we kind of see it all come to a head. Sorry, bad joke. In verse 2, Paul says, I am telling you that if you have yourselves circumcised, having Christ won't help you. Again, I swear to every man who has himself circumcised that he is required to do the whole law. You people who are trying to be made righteous by the law have been estranged from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. We eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness through the Spirit by faith. Being circumcised or not circumcised doesn't matter in Christ Jesus, but faith working through love does matter. Paul tells us right here that freedom is a constellation made up of spirit, faith, and grace. The life of discipleship isn't about what we are against, but what we are for. They're not against circumcision, but they are against it being the gatekeeper for this inclusive spiritual community that is forming. It's about faith, which I would argue is futuristic hope. And that faith is working through love, which is how we're showing up in the present. You see, Jesus' ministry among the poor, the sick, the rejected, offers us an alternative way to be human. And I believe that instead of victimizing and scapegoating others, as we have done through religious history, we can stop this process before it begins. I'm wondering if we could create a community here that values otherness over everything else. We can escape this bias by moving from so-and-so is not blank enough. So-and-so is not Christian enough. So-and-so is not black enough. So-and-so is not queer enough. So-and-so is not conservative enough. So-and-so is not liberal enough. So-and-so is not disabled enough or woke enough. We can move from that way of thinking to actually listening with empathy. We can move to choosing to acknowledge someone's humanity over everything else. Jackie Lewis reminds us that the diversity of human community is actually what helps us to break out of these biases. And I bet most of us in this room this morning can point to a specific time when we were stuck or stubborn, whatever you want to call it, and then some kind of great love or great suffering broke us out of it. Because contact is disruptive, but it's also joyful. So how do we help cultivate it? You know, they call it in the podcast that we've been listening to a holy curiosity. How do we develop that for each other? How do we listen to people we don't agree with and not want to change them? I think we choose humanity and stories over all the other things. When we acknowledge someone's humanity by listening to their story, their hurts, their hang-ups, their fears, their joys, their whys, we are valuing otherness. Can we practice looking at people as humans and not as opinions? Richard Rohr reminds us that having information is not enlightenment, awareness, or consciousness. We have to put these things into practice. So this morning, I ask all of you to get a coffee cup as you came through the door. And I want to tell you that there's nothing magical about a real coffee cup, but there's something that happens. Whenever we don't use paper cups and we use a real cup, there's an unrushed, unhurried, I feel special feeling that I think we feel. The last few months since we've reopened Greenhouse, I started with paper cups with our breakfast in the morning with our leaders, our volunteers. And it was very rushed. They felt like they had to take their coffee to go, get to their classroom, get set up. And one Sunday I switched to real cups, and the conversation took off. I had to send them to their classrooms whenever it was time because they sat there and I just listened, and they shared stories about their week together. They shared stories about their life together. Sometimes I had to say, stop talking, because they talk so much. So this morning, as you have this real cup, I want us to take 10 minutes to have a coffee and conversation time together. Or you can do hot tea. And yes, I realize having a tea time on the day we celebrate our independence from tea time is probably a little ironic. But Sean told us last week we can be and people and do two things and like and dislike certain things that come from the same place. So I want this 10 minutes to be a space of unrushed, undisrupted conversation with someone you don't know. I know some of you introverts are probably like, oh my gosh. There were conversation starters that I gave you just in case you need that. And they were at the table, so there's more in there if you feel like you need them. If you're online, we have Tommy back there. Tommy is going to facilitate discussion through our Facebook group. So if you're in that chat, you can talk in there amongst yourselves. And if you're outside, we invite you. You are welcome to come in here with us, or you can stay outside and talk amongst yourselves. You also have coffee and cups and conversation starters out there. So if we can, we are going to put a 10-minute timer on the screen. At 10 minutes, or at 0 minutes, sorry, I would like for you to return to your seats. So you may go. Thank you so much for participating in that. I knew that would be hard for some of you and probably super exciting for some of you. When I told Tommy we were doing this, I think he almost did a cartwheel because he's so excited. So I appreciate you all stepping outside of your comfort zone this morning to do that. I really, really feel that the way that we behave to each other is the fullest expression of what we believe. So I don't know about you, but I'm going to try really hard to communicate my values and heartbreak in vulnerable ways. I'm going to try to take off my tribe's jersey and this fake medal of superiority and choose to listen and love and hope. It's a lot easier to be cynical and to stand with the ones who see the world the same as you. But remember, It's in the diversity that we break away from community bias. There's power in connecting to those outside of our bubble. And it helps us to remember that we're all different and that God doesn't break hearts in the same way. I want to close with a story where 3 blindfolded people were led over to an elephant and asked to guess what they were touching. One touched only the side and guessed they were touching a leather object. The other one touched only the trunk, and they wondered if it was a snake. Another one touched the tail and knew it was an animal, but they didn't know exactly what kind of animal it was. It was only until they talked to each other and shared what they had found that they were able to put together an accurate picture and realize that it was an elephant. So this morning, as you go away, I pray that we are people who have conversations with each other. I pray that we are people who listen without wanting to change each other. I pray that we are people who think about humanity over what our tribe tells us. I pray that we are people who love greatly. Thank you for being here this morning.